I'll start with this because this is the right question. The right question is, why bother doing this? Why bother with this strange old book at all? That's a good question. It's a contradictory document that's been cobbled together over thousands of years. It's outlasted kingdoms, many, many kingdoms. You know, it's really interesting that it turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle. It's more durable than an empire. I'm approaching the biblical stories as if they're a mystery, fundamentally, because they are. There's a lot we don't understand about them. We don't understand how they came about. We don't really understand how they were put together. We don't understand why they had such an unbelievable impact on civilization. We don't understand how people could have believed them. We don't understand what it means that we don't believe them now, or even what it would mean if we did believe them. On top of all that, there's the additional problem, which isn't specific to me, but is certainly relevant to me, that no matter how educated you are, you're not educated enough to discuss the psychological significance of the biblical stories. When I'm lecturing, I'm thinking, I'm not trying to tell you what I know for sure to be the case, because there's lots of things I don't know for sure to be the case.
All books grew out of in some profound sense, particularly in the West, all books grew out of the Bible. And so that's interesting to me. It's interesting to me partly because we seem to have a lot of trouble in our culture now agreeing on what might constitute a valid canon of books. Well, certainly part of what religious tradition offered was a canonical book. I mean, Judaism has a canonical book, and Christianity has a canonical book, and Islam has a canonical book, and all the major Abrahamic religions have agreed that, in some sense, the followers of those religions are people of the book. It isn't obvious that you would consider a book the most fundamental element of your culture. It might be more obvious that you might consider a city a more fundamental element, or a dynasty, or something overtly political. But that isn't what a huge portion of the world has decided. We seem to have decided that no, we're founded on a book. And we have some dispute about just exactly what that book is and what it means. But the fact that we've at least agreed that it's a book, that's something. And I don't know what it is exactly, and that's partly what I want to investigate tonight. Now, the Bible, in its various forms, isn't exactly a book. It's a library of books, right? It's a collection of books, but it's an interesting collection of books, to say the least, because despite the fact that it's a library, so a collection of books, it also has a narrative theme that runs through it, right? It has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it has a plot, strangely enough. And I say strangely because how did it get plotted exactly? Anything that's complex is susceptible to ever increasingly deep explanations. In some sense, if something's deep, you never get to the bottom of it, and all explanations are insufficient. But I think it's a remarkable fact, speaking psychologically and historically, that there's a book at the basis of our culture, and that's how we define the culture, as based on the book, and that it's a collection of books, and that the collection was aggregated so that a plot emerges from it. And Christians take that idea one step further in some sense, because they assume that not only is the Old Testament a library of books that has a plot, but that implicit in that book is the New Testament. It's somehow there a priori before the events actually unfold. And that's an extremely bizarre and interesting idea, and it's very difficult to know what to make of it. We now seem to have reached an impasse in our culture about what can be validly considered canonical. The problem of perception was a much more intractable problem than anybody had heretofore suspected. And so that emerged partly in the field of artificial intelligence, when the first artificial intelligence researchers who were interested in robotics tried to make machines that could operate in the real world like animals could. The idea to begin with was that the difficult part would be programming the robot to operate in the environment, The easy part would be getting the robot to perceive the environment, because after all, there it is. You just have to look and everything's self-evident. And it turned out that that wasn't the case at all. And this was reflective of a philosophical problem that had been recognized by David Hume sometime earlier, which is the problem of the relationship between what is and what ought to be. And David Hume believed that there was an unbridgeable gap between the factual world and the ethical world, in some sense, that you never had enough facts at your disposal to compute your trajectory into the future with any degree of certainty. How do you guide your actions in light of the facts when there are endless facts about absolutely everything, absolutely everywhere, all the time? Which facts do you attend to guide yourself forward? Which facts do you prioritize? And which do you ignore? Because obviously you have to ignore most of them, because there's a near infinite number of facts, and you're not going to pay attention to all of them because you can't. And so how do you decide what not to pay attention to? And the answer is, you don't know. And that's the general answer, is which we don't know. And it's exactly the same as the problem of perception, because when you look out at the world, or hear the world for that matter, or taste the world, any of those things, any sensory interaction with the world, is there's way more things to look at than you can possibly look at, and yet you do look at things and you see. We can't see the world except through an ethical framework. It's actually technically not possible. And this is a new realization. I mean, we had Hume's observation that you can't easily get from what is to what ought to be, and that's an early statement of the same problem. Why can't you? Well, too many facts. Which facts are you going to use to guide you? You select facts. How do you select facts? And if you're selecting facts, why are they facts? Because you've selected them, right? You might think if they're facts, you have to sort of randomly select them, because otherwise you're biased in your selection of facts. And if you're biased in selection of your facts, then it's not facts. It's more like misinformation or disinformation or whatever the hell it is that people are accused of following now, because your bias is disturbing your interaction with the facts. I would say that's one of the claims that the postmodern radicals make all the time, is that your perception is nothing but your biases. It's a pretty bloody dismal way of looking at the world. It's like there's your bias and my bias, and there's no truth and there's no ethic. There's just your bias and my bias, and which one should win? It's like, well, I guess we'll find out, won't we? There is an ethic, like a fundamental ethic, that has some basis in, let's say, some basis in reality, a transcendent ethic that's real. That ethic is something that people could mutually explore as a consequence of their goodwill and their honest discourse. Those are propositions, right? They're deeply embedded in Western culture, and I think they're fundamental to the people of the book. They're particularly well developed, well, both in Judaism and Christianity. I don't know the development as well in the Islamic world, but no, we do believe that as believers, that people are of divine worth and that they can exchange information honestly, and the information is actually about the world, and that there is such a thing as an ethic, and that ethic is related to the integral worth of each individual, and that worth manifests itself, let's say, in our capacity for honest speech, and that capacity for honest speech is in some real sense redemptive. And we do believe that, and that's part of the religious presuppositions in which our whole culture is embedded. I say religious in part because I think they're first principles, and maybe you could define what's truly religious as what is a first principle. You choose to live a certain way. You choose to live, for example, as if other people have worth, and you do too, and that worth is absolute in some sense. And if you're an admirer of the natural rights tradition, well, you would claim that we derive our notion of natural rights from a deeper understanding that each of us is of fundamental and intrinsic worth, which I think is pretty much akin to making the biblical claim that man and women are created in the image of God. If God is emblematic of what constitutes the highest worth, and we're made in that image, that means that we partake in what's of absolute worth, and then you decide, in some sense, to base your whole society on that presupposition. And it looks to me like societies that do accept that presupposition and move forward from that first principle produce the sorts of societies that people would rather live in if they had their choice. And societies that don't accept those first principles don't. It does seem to me that societies that presuppose intrinsic worth at the individual level, which is a very weird proposition given the radical differences in ability between people. It's much easier in some sense to see that highly successful people are much more worthwhile than people who are poverty-stricken and struggling, or that people who are highly intelligent are worthwhile in a much more fundamental way than people who aren't. I mean, you could say that with regard to every individual difference and every talent. It's a much more natural way of thinking. The notion that we're all of intrinsic worth despite our variability, it's like, that's a hell of an idea. It's absolutely amazing to me that that idea ever obtained any purchase anywhere under any conditions. You know, we sort of think about it in some sense as self-evident now, although it's subject to intense questioning at the moment. But that blinds us, I think, to just exactly how miraculous that idea really is and how unlikely it is. And yet it seems to be a fundamental necessity for the organization of the kind of social institutions that we would choose to inhabit if we had our choice.